So let's go around and do introductions.
Yeah.
Right on. Alright. So I'm Kathy Nichols with the Division of Medical Assistance. Dave is out of the office today, so he won't be with us. Pardon?
Dave's not here.
Nothing gets by you.
Kathy.
Let's go around to the left.
That would be me. I'm Carrier with the Autism Society of North Carolina.
I'm Bob Hager with North Carolina Body Shops.
First only parent. John Nash, York, North Carolina.
Matthew Potter, Community Advocate at Large.
And then if we could just have our guests introduce themselves around the outside.
I'm Ellen Perry, and this is Lynn, my assistant. And I am wearing many hats.
And I am Mary Short, and this is my daughter Katie. I have a group of about 200 families, and we represent the severe and profound end of the scale.
I'm Paula Cox-Fishman. I am guardian of my older sister who lives at Murdoch Developmental Center.
I'm Deb Goda. I'm with the Division of Medical Assistance.
I'm Joshua Strasberg with the Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services.
Monica Hamlin with DMA.
You okay with it?
You need to pick up Beretta. Lisa Jackson, DMA.
Kenneth Boswell, DMA.
Sarah Palmer, here and there.
And I'm Jamie Markham with East Carolina Behavioral Health.
So we got the minutes out this time, right? Did they go out? No, we still didn't do the minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did.
No, I'm thinking about the 4 o'clock.
Okay, Renee actually had some minor surgery, and we will get them out to you. I promise. It was relatively minor, nothing to worry about, but I didn't know if she managed to get them out first or not. So we need to get the minutes out, please. Thank you. So we'll skip the review of the previous meeting minutes, and so let me back up for a second. We said we were going to try to get everything in today, and this is going to be the last of our work days. And I won't say I lied. I'll say that we tried our best, but there will be one more to come after this, which will be community guide. So at the end, we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do about that. But for now, it's mostly this. Other than that, I think these are the rest of our definitions.
Probably when we do community diet, get community transition done.
And the utilization review portion is done.
The policy is, and we're going to go over kind of what we've been doing with AP, just as a quick kind of thing.
But I mean, for as far as that's today.
Yeah.
Anything remaining from today?
No.
And then the care coordination piece, I think that is more or less with your comments ready for the waiver, right, ladies? Care coordination's good-ish. Yes. Taking all of your comments. So the goal is, I think, and you can think about this, and we'll talk about this at the end, whether or not you think we can just get your comments back on care coordination by the end of the month, because Deb's already started on the template to get something posted beginning of May for public comment, or whether you feel like you want to come back next Friday to talk about that before then. Those are kind of your choices. So we'll talk about that. And then it'd be a short meeting if we got together next Friday in theory, because that would be the only thing on the agenda. So having...
Yeah, we'd probably be able to bring community guide to that one as well.
Well, no, I'm saying that's the only thing you would bring.
Oh, I think it's in care coordination.
Oh, maybe I did say that, but that's not what I meant. Pardon?
Like SES or some of the early ones. Did y'all redo them?
We've incorporated feedback.
But we look at them again or no?
Yeah.
I wasn't sure the process.
That would really be a benefit, as we talked before, we kind of
You want us to send everything out again?
And the question is, what we said, what made it? Or what didn't? Are the things that we still need to be, provide input on?
Well, we should be able, yeah, no, that's a good point. We should be able to send those out today, Monday.
Probably we can send something, maybe in groups, that we have more information on. We're still incorporating some of the feedback of the local groups as well.
So everything that you have today or first thing Monday?
Monday.
Is there any way to do it where it's saying for you to, what changes you made since the last draft we saw, so that we would be able to see
track
that?
changes.
That's right. If it's track changes or whatever, highlight method or whatever you had, so we wouldn't have to reread everything that we wanted to.
Okay.
This week's kind of a busy week, legislatively, and this too, it sounds like.
Keeps you young.
Is that it?
Yes, Bill.
Is there any way, did y'all talk about what my concern was about care coordination?
You have to forgive me. I don't remember.
Did,
Oh, yes, Chris. When
Yeah.
you had spoken to Chris about, yes, we did.
Yes.
We made a point of making sure that we discussed that. Don't ask me what the outcome was. Because
well, I just wanted to.
all I remember actually
I
was
just wanted
Chris
to make-
saying Ellen wanted to bring up
Yeah, I
the
just
point,
wanted,
but
I could not be here.
So, no, yes, he did bring it up.
Right.
Was that the piece about the Medicaid, care coordinators understanding the Medicaid? Yeah, so that was,
Yeah.
okay.
I remember.
I thought I was saying it to myself.
Okay. So that was part of the competencies. I don't think we had gotten to that part in the document before Chris brought it up.
So Monica's saying yes, so it was them having an understanding of Medicaid, that was what it was? No?
I don't think it was, but I can't remember what it was about now. But it was something, I remember talking.
Do you remember, Short?
I haven't posted the video to YouTube yet.
So none of us remember what
No,
it was.
but I remember him bringing it up.
Yeah, but I
You
can't.
talked about the responsiveness of care coordination that there were different levels of an emergency. Sometimes you had an urgent need that, where you needed somebody to be very responsive. I know that was one of the points that you made.
Okay. I just want to make sure that got in.
No, yeah, Chris gets the gold star, but none of us see.
Okay.
So much time has passed, and I guess we all keep so busy, I can't remember, being perfectly honest with you. Won't feel bad if nobody else does either. It's in the minutes, I'm sure.
Which we don't have, but I do have. Are we ever going to address the relative as provider issue at this group or not?
Is that on the schedule, Deb?
Is that louder?
Relative as provider?
Relative as provider, I think that'll be in the cleanup list of decision points that went into resource allocation.
So is that going to come to this group?
Yes.
Okay.
And limit on sets of services. Is that something this group is going to be discussing?
No. I don't think, so when you say limits on sets of services,
Appendix
I think
C.
as we've gone through this, we're tending not to have any limits on anything. I guess there's the $5,000 limit, for instance, for the home modification and the what you doodle.
Well, some of the drafts of the service definitions have reference to that appendix about limits on sets of services. So I don't see how you can fully comment unless you see what that appendix says.
Right, I think, go ahead.
Well, I think that what we have to take into consideration is that resource allocation model is not built yet. So within those clinical descriptions, that's going to be, that will take away the necessity for a lot of the limits on sets of services. I don't know if that will have to have something on top of that.
Yeah, I think if the model is well built, that we shouldn't have an issue, but we can take one last look. I think we were just waiting.
Right.
So I think basically what we're trying to say is we're trying to do away with limits.
My understanding is that appendix is all supposed to be about dollars, not about hours. And so that first little section where we currently have hours described
Right.
will simply not be completed, and it will just reference the budget categories, that's your limit on sets of,
Right. And that's how we're going to try to achieve our cost
right,
neutralities from this budgeting model.
right,
So it wouldn't be limits on sets of services.
correct.
Does that make sense?
Well, right, and that's really
And I think
one of my personal pet peeves is the limit on sets of services as it currently exists.
so we're trying not to have that.
Correct.
So-
If you give me a budget and I want to buy nothing but personal care with it and it totals 20 hours, what do you care? As long as it's within the budget.
But, right.
Or if I want to spend 40 hours on supported employment and do all of the personal care as a volunteer, what do you care, as long as it's in the budget?
I mean, right? I'm looking to you for confirmation, but.
Personal care won't be a service because we'll have the blended service.
Right.
Well, the point, her point
The
is.
point, yeah, the point is now, as far as setting the rates on the sets of services, if you were doing employer of record, you would have that rate setting ability within parameters, but yeah, if you want to take and spend all of your hours on the blended service, or if you want to spend all of your budget on supported employment and there's a job and it meets that criteria, there shouldn't be an issue.
And some families want to use more respite and some families don't, and that's why,
I mean, that, again, one of the big values, I think, underlying this change is flexibility.
we're hoping.
But another one is also responsibility. So, you know, you can't use all your dollars on respite and then turn around and say, I've exceeded my budget because, and I want, I don't know, a vehicle modification.
Right.
But this, you know what I mean?
Oh, I know, yeah. I think,
That's an example, but I mean, you know, flexibility, but personal responsibility too. So that's kind of that's definitely, I think, underlying values for all of us for this. So
it'll be
okay,
interesting.
let's let
All right,
Kevin-
thanks.
Kevin.
Can we talk about your, answering the
Kenneth?
question?
I was going to let you answer at the end, but okay. Think about
So
it.
having a meeting next week,
Yeah.
getting the service definitions that are with latest revisions
Yeah.
for us to review, and then having the opportunity to meet next week would be my preference, to be able to have a time to certainly see, is one opinion. The other thing is you mentioned care coordination, and I think you meaning community guide. One of the big questions for the community guide is,
For you guys, are outstanding definition, the one that you
Right.
have not seen.
right, so one of the things with community guide was whether, and to what extent, it was going to take some of the components of care coordination or not.
Okay.
That we thought were deficit areas, that we talked, we spent a lot of time on that at one of the meetings. So we have an opportunity to discuss that.
So just to understand, you want to talk about community guided context of the care coordination definition, so you guys would be prepared to, you guys understand what he's asking for?
Yes, we were meeting on Tuesday to try to flush out community guide and how that relates, so.
Right, but
that's
that
our
also
hope.
means that Monica and Lisa need to be prepared to. So does that work for everybody? It's one more week, but. Such excited faces. I'm gonna take that as a resounding okay. So there's 15 service officers, right?
Wow.
I don't know, actually. Is it 15?
Yeah, we have about
We have,
7 more to go.
but some of them won't have complete overhauls.
Right. And some of them have already had some changes made to them, like
Yeah.
kind of talk about the specialized consultative services, for instance. While we've not gone over that as a separate service definition, there have been some components from other service definitions that have been taken and implemented into SCS.
Getting a copy of the red line as early as possible would certainly be beneficial.
That's why I want to make sure we get them out Monday. I know sometimes we tell you we're going to do things a little later than we say, but we will put a,
We'll do the one.
Even if it comes out on Thursday morning, I would think that meeting on Friday would not be of value to us. Just
well,
'cause you don't have a
community
chance
guide
to
won't
look into
because
it.
they're not talking about till Tuesday, but hopefully he'll get it out Tuesday night. No pressure.
It's a face-to-face, so we should be able to knock out.
But everything else, everything else that you don't have, you can get it out
Well,
Monday night.
it might be good if I could get all of it out Tuesday night.
Well, just know that
I
that's
think
a
they're
lot of
better
material
off.
to dig through.
The more you can, I think Monday's better,
Okay, so
honestly.
we'll get a big chunk out Monday, and then if there's some outstanding things, we'll try to wrap up Tuesday.
That'd be swell. Thank you, Kevin. You're doing a fabulous job.
Great.
All right,
We're
so
ready then.
let's go through these and then we'll come back. Seriously, everybody's okay, I mean, not okay, but is willing to put up with the meeting next Friday. So Deb, please, thank you. And then, so, okay, support and employment.
Okay, we'll get this back going.
Turned off, did you see this camera?
Uh-huh.
Okay,
There we go, perfect.
Oh, wow, popped right up.
And JV is going to,
Be his assistant.
we'll do it together. So, the first definition that we're going to go over with you guys is supported employment. I'm going to wait for you guys to get it quick. Okay, there we go. Okay, so if you notice, it says what is supported employment. That's, for whatever reason, it's not really on the screen so well. And then you have the definition in front of you now. So supported employment is a service that provides assistance with choosing, acquiring, and maintaining a job. And what we're looking at is including an initial and a long-term supports section. We wanted the initial, and what we tried to do with the language is to make the initial seem that it's based more on being more active, more engaged, and then more intensive. The long-term portion would be less intensive, but also could give you that follow along if you needed kind of basic supervision. So that. So the next one is what does initial supported employment do? So this is what you have on the definition, but also we have it out here. So we tried to make it flexible, but again more active. So assisting people with developing skills to seek, obtain, and maintain competitive employment, developing and operating a micro enterprise. So that intensive part to get going. What can it be? Pre-job training, education, and developmental activities for people, so if they're not really ready for a job, they can have more intensive to get ready. Assisting an individual to develop and operate micro enterprise, which we talked about. We wanted to have it coaching and employment support activities, providing technical support to potential employees regarding federal ADA accommodations and requirements. What we see a lot of times is that people may have a job, but then their job doesn't make any accommodations for them. So we want the supported employment individual to help kind of facilitate that conversation and educate them on that.
Well, and just to piggyback off that, I think with the initial supported employment, we really wanted this to be more of an active service and more, for lack of a better word, kind of aggressive, actual job seeking and job attainment and job maintaining as well. What we have kind of seen is that oftentimes individuals kind of get stuck in that pre-job state where there's a lot of job searching, and not the actual job obtainment. So we wanted to make this a little clearer as far as the expectations of what the service should entail.
Then long-term follow-up, so this is at the top. It'll be less intensive. either be a follow-along, it could be supervisory support for people who have medical, physical, and behavioral support needs. And what we've heard a lot is that someone may get a job, but they may have general physical support needs, and they can't really maintain their job, and they get stuck with this intensive initial support employment. But really what they need is someone just there to make sure they can have their physical support needs taken care of.
Or for a means of supervision.
Right.
We have quite a few individuals who are able to actually complete the job tasks, but they just need somebody to help out with supervision, but not actual day-to-day functions.
Job activities.
Right. Did you have a question?
You know why people quit their job after 9 months? Because of SSI, right, John?
Yeah.
Am I correct?
I don't know the equipment, but they certainly have a hard time getting jobs when the income issue at the ranger level could lose benefits.
And so I think that if we want long-term support, follow-up, then we're going to have to make sure that that the Social Security Administration understands that.
Well, and there's actually a lot of workarounds around that currently. The 9-month period there's a trial work period. That's only with Social Security disability if you're receiving that type of SSI. It's after a certain amount of time. It's for every $2 you earn, they're going to reduce your check for $1. But there's impairment-related work expenses that you can do around that, and that's where key benefits counseling comes in while you're looking for jobs, when you first get a job, to determine whether or not that's a good choice or not. So there are things that are set up so that people aren't, and the system actually has, it was probably about 2 years ago now that you can no longer be denied Medicaid if you go to work, which was always a really big thing. So, and I don't think people are as aware of that now. So there are a lot of things that are out there already that Social Security really isn't necessarily going to tell you about, because you're going to know these through work programs. But if somebody's helping you to find a job, they should know all of these things and help you, direct you into those areas, because they do exist.
But see, some people like to go out and find their own job, too. And some people need support, too.
So maybe the suggestion is, in terms of this definition, to make sure that some of your requirements that people
Employment first and things like that.
is
Okay.
part of the skill set for that worker.
Okay.
Or that this also could just be a piece of it, that if somebody doesn't need the intensive skills, that it can provide the counseling needed to help somebody understand their benefits and how the impact of a job would be on them. I don't know if how that exists with benefits counselors right now, or if you're going through vocational rehabilitation.
Can you pay for that?
Part of the counseling.
It could be just that. I don't know if we could pay for just that. Do you know what I mean?
Well, and I would guess if someone needs some assistance with that piece, there's going to be a few other areas that there's going to
Right,
be
so
some
if they have that
assistance.
supported employment, we could build that in, that those discussions are happening.
Right.
Counseling and education.
Yeah, but I'm awfully concerned that people are not, self-advocates do not understand that piece.
Okay. Okay, so that we'd have to wrap that in somewhere else, but that's a very good point.
And self-advocates are not going to understand the definitions at all. So we're going to have to come down on language a lot.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, I was just gonna sort of piggyback on some of that, and say that I have had some exposure to employment support services through vocational rehabilitation, and there needs to be, this is more a general statement, but there needs to be way stronger understanding of benefits pretty much across the board. Because even at vocational rehab, I would ask somebody about whether or not a certain amount of income would affect my benefits, or what the exact numbers were. And they'd be like, oh, I don't know, ask this person. And then I'd ask the person that they directed me to, and that person wouldn't know either. And then I'd call the Social Security office directly, and they'd give me some ballpark number, but they wouldn't give me the exact numbers for whatever reason, because they didn't know, or they didn't want to bother getting the exact formula or whatever it was. But whatever the case, when I was with vocational rehab, there was a time that they had an independently employed benefits counselor who they were contracting with. And then all of a sudden, that contract ran out, and they didn't have the benefits counselor anymore. And the second they didn't have the benefits counselor, nobody knew anything about that stuff.
Right, so that's a barrier for getting a job because you're scared you're going to lose your
It's
benefits.
a huge barrier.
Yeah.
And that was one thing that we had communicated about as a group, not necessarily the benefit portion, but just the barrier of VR in general. So the way it's been looked at in the past is that an individual has to access vocational rehab first, and then you can tap into innovation waiver, supported employment services. And so as a group, we talked about the fact that the location where I am, for instance, our vocational rehab center contracts with 2 different agencies, which obviously we contract with more than 2 agencies. Out of those 2 agencies that VR contracts with, only one of them is the innovation waiver provider. So what happens is somebody goes through VR, they get hooked up with one agency, they go and exhaust the VR hours for the supported employment, and then they have a choice to either, if they happen to choose the one agency that provides innovation waiver services, then they could be fine. They would continue to receive services under under the innovation waiver with that agency. However, if they happen to choose the one agency who does not provide innovation waiver services, then they have to switch to another agency. So it seems like it's a little bit of inconsistency and loopholes that individuals are having to unfortunately go through.
Right, we're trying to work through.
We have enough.
Right, and yes.
We have enough to jump hoops through.
You have enough hoops.
Yeah, to jump through. We don't need any more hoops.
No more hoops.
Right.
And
I do. There's a resource that I don't know if you all are aware of, but I've used it in the past when I was helping people on other employment teams. It's called the Social Security Red Book. It's put out by the Social Security
I've heard of it.
Administration, and it will help you walk through with examples of either SSIBDs or SSDIBDs.
But that's probably more important for an employment worker to have,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? So
It is, but I mean, it's for anybody.
Yeah. No, I hear you.
You can download it, but it gives examples of how much your monthly check is and how much you can work and.
But see that red.
There's a formula.
But see, the red book doesn't make any sense to self-advocates. So, I mean, I
hear we hear you.
Yeah, we'll definitely try to wrap that around.
So what I'm hearing you saying that is that somebody does not necessarily have to exhaust VR first now? Is that going to be a part of this new definition? Just glancing through, I did not see anything about that. So I was wondering, is that going to be for some people who choose just to go through innovations waiver, do they have to access the VR piece first?
They do, and we talked about instead of repeating the same things both with the definitions, putting it in the general sections, that we cannot duplicate IDEA and we cannot duplicate.
All of it does.
So that's if someone can benefit from VR, so we have possibly, if VR feels like they can't, or the community feels like they can't, then they may be able to move forward.
Yeah, if VR says that this person is not appropriate for our service,
Then you can access.
yes, and then the long-term follow-on after the 90 days, VR doesn't provide it anyway, so that's definitely something we can do.
Yeah.
But the waiver prohibits us from duplicating another federal employee.
There's some of the, I don't know, you probably know better than me, but under the mental health or employment definition, there's a lot more flexibility around VR, so I don't know if y'all want to look at the DOJ one. Yeah, I don't think we, well, I mean, it can't be the same, you know what I mean, there may be some language in there that.
Yeah.
have y'all ever thought about getting together with VR and talking through?
We actually met with them briefly yesterday, so we'll continue to coordinate with them as we try to operationalize all this.
That'd be great.
Okay. So with long-term follow-up, we also have, it's going to have coaching and employment support, assistance, counseling, and guidance for micro-enterprise. So we're, continuing to give people support who need it after they've been more stabilized. Consultation with work-related needs to proactively address the issue. So if someone got a promotion or got more hours or got new tasks, then they could come in to assist with that. If someone's having an issue with their job, then we could proactively address that. And then again, providing that technical support regarding ADA accommodations and requirements. So just to make sure that people know that is something that's needed. So why do we feel like support employment is important? It maximizes self-sufficiency, increases self-determination, and helps a person with finding and maintaining a job, which we all enjoy working. So that's very important. There's one other kind of question that we had as a discussion point that was related to transportation. And in the current definition, supported employment has transportation built in. We were thinking as a group in a way that may set someone up for failure almost, that if you give them a job where they need that direct support, if someone has to step back, how do they become independent? So we were kind of trying to get some of your feedback as a group on that.
And I think what we had talked about in regards to that was maybe still having transportation built into maybe the supported employment portion, the initial supported employment portion of it, because that is going to be much more intense. However, they do have to have the mindset that I can't go and find a job for an individual that is 30 minutes away. Is there going to be a bus route, or is there going to be a cab or something, or another avenue of transportation? Or like Kenneth said, are you just setting them up for failure? And what we said was to maybe look at not having it be a part of the long-term follow-up, because again, just ensuring that the individual is reaching maximum independence as much as possible. But then there is the kind of standalone transportation service definition.
And I think where we've run into trouble with that before is saying if it's understood that it's covered under another definition. And right now, please correct me if I'm wrong, long-term and supported employment are blended together. So right now, so you'd have to almost break that out. So long-term is definitely segmented differently, because what'll happen is well, we can't do it because it's definitely built into that. Or even before they get to the long-term phase, is somebody before they go all out on their own or partially out on their own, you're going to try and jump in and check on them, right? So if you don't have a piece of transportation written even into the supported employment piece of it, until they stabilize, you're going to randomly check on them. You may not be providing the transportation. So in a lot of rural communities, they may not have another option for getting to a job unless there is a transportation piece, because they're relying on somebody else. So I think that's true in the supported employment side as well.
Right, and what we had talked about was actually splitting those two service definitions.
Right, to be two different modifiers.
But still included, what I'm saying is you still may need a separate piece for transportation in the supported employment part.
Right.
Okay, we understand.
Okay.
And that's what we talked about, having transportation and supported employment, but maybe not in a long-term follow-up.
Well, I'm saying you may want to look at it on that initial phase too, because the way you're describing it and the way typical supported employment works, I don't just all of a sudden say, okay, you're on your own.
Right.
Right, so with building in that independence piece, it's going to happen in that supported employment phase, not just the long-term
So maybe
phase.
build that in as a task in the initial, that transportation is something that actively addressed.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can definitely do that.
Even in my community, where where we have good transportation, I have trouble getting around sometimes. Because I can't just jump on the bus and go from point A to point B to point C to point D to point E and back without 2.5 or 3 hours.
Right.
And that's a long day.
That's a barrier, right?
That's a long day. So have you talked to the rural transportation people over in the state?
We have not yet, but that's a good suggestion.
That would be one of my suggestions, getting and making sure that in like Chapel Hill Harbor has a good transportation system, but right outside Chapel Hill Harbor doesn't have anything.
Right.
The rural, it's very rural, and Hillsborough doesn't have anything either, really.
Okay.
Some of our folks, and I did this myself.
And they're
The location of where jobs are, particularly in the rural communities, which we have a lot of. Jobs are in this community, but I'm located in that community, getting from one to the other in a timely fashion, to be there on time, to be able to keep the job, which is always a critical thing, clocking in on time. Particularly if it's a morning clock and if it's a 2-hour bus ride, you may not have access to public transportation. So there's some issues with regards to getting people to and from in order to support employment.
It presents some additional challenges around using Medicaid dollars to do so. And I mean, the Department of Transportation and their budget is a whole nother, whatever word I can't think of right now.
It's a beast.
Beast is a perfectly good word, but we can't just pay for transportation. Even with non-emergency medical transportation, it's for medical appointments. So it gets into,
It's complicated.
yeah, it really does. I mean,
But at the same time, I think we want to recognize and respect the fact that we would prefer so that individuals don't have to have that 2.5-hour bus ride to work 3 hours, to ride 2.5 hours back home, and that's not a fun-filled.
And while this is not a conversation for Medicaid and the waiver, probably is a discussion for the department to take up at some point, and needs to have with Federal Department of Transportation and their needs.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind
this is
sitting
more
in
just,
on
I
that
was more
one.
just, I guess, making the point that this is a much bigger issue than a supported employment definition.
Yeah.
Well, that, supported, but that's the big, it's a key to getting a job.
Sure.
Transportation is the key to
Well,
getting.
we can't pay for transportation.
Yeah, I know, but transportation is the key to getting a job.
It is, it absolutely is.
So,
And I think if you eliminate that the entire directly to the service definition, understand there has to be another workaround, we know it can't be done through this, then you're going to have a lot more providers who are willing to do it, who if they feel like they have to figure out how to pay for transportation, it does not become an economical service to provide.
It's too bad that you don't have some kind of approach that's more inclusive of here's your budget for supported employment and your transportation budget is part of this budget. And that way you don't have, because every person has an individualized case and different people have different issues that would require, transportation. Some may not. Some may have family members that are supportive of that transportation because it's only 5 miles down the road. So it's almost like, once again, here's this big elephant in the room, and yet maybe if it was a more inclusive type of aspect to the supported employment where,
Well, we can
this is
build
the
it
budget
into
for
the
this.
definition, but then if you start to phase out that service, because you no longer need supported employment, you just need transportation.
I
don't know how many people are, I'm just going to be real frank here. I've worked with the IDD community for 20 years now, and I don't know that many people that can, put it this way, it's a very low percentage of people that will not require long-term supported employment. So I don't necessarily.
But then back to like Melissa's point, then what do? It disincentivizes your rate.
Providers are responsible for providing the transportation fees or arranging transportation fees. As part of that, it just doesn't work out. But usually, in order for someone to get a job, you do have to have transportation worked out. For all of us, we have to. And so how do you do that? How do you work it out? And that's part of that upfront discussion and negotiations before you go to find a job. What are the areas and how are you going to get there?
I think that's a really good point, so we'll definitely build that.
Granted that transportation is part of Medicaid services, is not, and that's what you have non-emergency medical transport for, and that covers that. But doesn't, under the supported employment definition, allow for job accommodations and supports? Doesn't
No,
this
you can do it
qualify
as part
as
of the service definition. But, I mean, if you're drawing it out to the extent that that's all the service you're providing, for instance.
But if it's a job accommodation and support to be able to keep and maintain employment, doesn't it meet the definition? And at that point, isn't it extendable? I may not need a person coaching me
That wants to
full-time.
talk to you.
I mean, you may not need a person coaching full-time, but having that job accommodation to be able to keep the job is.
And I think job accommodations, if you're talking about what can you use your, when you talk about pass-through and what are the things that you can claim as work expenses, like paying a coworker to transfer you to work. But when you're looking at Medicaid, if it's part of the service definition, it's part of you accessing that medically necessary service. It's why we have medical transportation. So if the service itself is just about transporting, then it's no longer about the medically necessary service that's being accessed. But I think that's where we're going to run into more of a problem.
So a question I have is, so this is discussed at the top of page 3 in the service definition. And how is what you're talking about now going to change from what it is here, which says service definition? Service includes transportation. How are you proposing, based on this conversation, that this would change?
So the question we asked was, should we pull that transportation out of that long-term follow-along? Because if someone keeps becoming more successful with their job, and there'll be certainly people who will that set them up for failure where then that transportation is just going to be pulled? From what you were speaking of, it's like having that conversation during that pre-job training education, like explicitly state that we're going to investigate transportation and those types of things.
It would seem, though, that if a large percentage of people need the transportation component with the long-term follow-along, which I agree is probably more likely, then if we take it out, then that's going to become a barrier that did not exist before.
If all I'm doing is providing transportation service, then I'm really not doing typical long-term follow-along. Outside of the waiver really is it's sporadic. Twice, by VR terms, it's 2 times a month you check on someone. So as a provider, I'm not going to sign up to do this service because I'm going to lose my shirt in providing transportation. Not only is it depending on miles, and then the staff time who's doing it, if that's all I'm doing.
Not only that, if you get audited, it's a payback.
Right. And that's the only service I'm doing daily.
So you wouldn't, if I can ask the question, so you can afford to do the service where you're doing transportation 5 days a week, but really only doing long-term support 2 days a week.
No, I'm saying if I'm doing long-term support, I want to do the piece that's helping the person maintain the job, not transportation. Because then I'm going to have to staff that. How am I going to staff all over time as well? Like if somebody's working now 7 to 8, their transportation needs are a half an hour in the morning on Saturday and a half an hour on Saturday evening. I've got to staff that. How am I going to do that for just that time? Unless I have the amount of time, and everybody's jobs work just right. So that's where you're going to get people who are going to say, I'm not providing that service, But right now, the way it's doing, most of our people actually go through VR first because they want to go to work, they're ready to work, but they need that long-term piece and more intensity, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe they just need a little bit of it. But all we're doing is helping them on the job with those job tasks. Like, what are any of the barriers? What are any of the things, maybe some extra training? And I don't have to get the whole case reopened through VR. I can do it through this, which is great. But they already have to have that transportation piece in place because I'm not transporting them when I check on them for long term. I'm popping in on them for a portion of their hours, not the whole time they're working.
Not every service provider is geared up to provide. We're talking, if it's a one-on-one type situation, that's very costly. If you're talking about a larger transport mode where you're maybe taking a 50-passenger van, you just up the ante, even though you've had more people, so you think you'd be defraying some of your costs, but you have higher levels of insurance, higher levels of inspections, and all of a sudden it becomes a much different animal. And unless you are geared up and really tuned into doing that, even without the revenue model in place, transport is difficult in the rural communities by any stretch.
Well, so Matt had something.
Yeah, I just need to kind of get something off my chest here, and I don't think that there's an answer to be found within the definition, which I acknowledge. So please just indulge me for a minute, because I know that there are people who work for the state, and I know that there are people who are high level at the state who will probably hear everything that is said in these meetings, even if they don't strictly fall underneath the purview of a definition. I'm going to be very frank. It shouldn't be this hard. I worked and lived in Washington, D.C. for about 10 weeks, 4 or 5 summers ago as an intern for a mental health nonprofit. And admittedly, Washington, D.C. has one of the best public transportation systems in the world. Having said that, I was able to almost completely on my own commute to and from work every day. I mean, I was beholden to a shuttle driver to get from a metro station to my office, because the office was a little bit outside the city. But it wasn't a disability-related thing. It was a shuttle that every worker in that area who had to get to that area took. It wasn't a disability-specific thing. And the fact is that this speaks to something of universal design, where if we as a state work harder on not having to go around your nose to get to your face in order to find something that is accessible for everybody involved, then we wouldn't need to just pore over this and agonize over it and work out rates and who's going to provide what. Providers are going to lose their shirts over this. It shouldn't be that complicated. Everybody needs to utilize transportation. And I realize it's tougher for a state like North Carolina, which is much more sprawling and the population density is different. But you go to places all over the country and they've got accessible taxi services that are not related to medical transportation. They've got public transportation that's accessible. And I think it's absurd how difficult the state of North Carolina makes it on themselves, when admittedly it would be a very large investment, but it would be an investment that in the long term would solve so many of these problems, and we wouldn't have to agonize over it anymore, and it wouldn't be tethered to Medicaid anymore, which last time I checked, the state has said that's something that they want to try to get away from. So invest more in transportation that doesn't have anything to do with Medicaid, that everybody can use.
Yep.
Well, just as a potential solution with this definition right here, since that top of page 3 really is underneath long-term, it looks like it's really related more to that. If you will just put that section of it up under the beginning part, under supported employment, you kind of note that it's more geared to that phase of it. You know, that you're helping a person as you're searching for the job with them, when you're initially training with them. I think it's understandable. You're going to provide the transportation, and the cost can be built into that.
But
which is what I think you were talking about earlier too.
But you have to investigate what's out there in the community. You have to know what's out there in the community.
Oh, well, that's part of that initial stages in the planning process. So as you were looking for a job with somebody, those are things you talk about.
Yep.
I think at this point that's the best we can probably do.
But also, Kathy, I think it would hurt for us to have a discussion with transportation.
Sure. Don't disagree, but that's
DOT.
Whole,
Different day and a different.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Well,
different
But I really
projects,
think
almost.
this whole process is a very long and involved and very complex process. And if we think that the only mechanism for meeting the need is Medicaid, we do ourselves a huge disservice.
Yeah. Right.
And we ought to be scheduling that discussion to talk about DOT monies and how we
And there might be such a conversation for all I know.
We used to have our
minor review, but
there are funds
Good
There
one.
were funds.
About so there you go. I mean, because, you're right, like even the VA, when we used to discharge from the VA, people couldn't get home in Fayetteville because they were going to some rural area, and I don't know how they got there, but they couldn't get home. So, I mean, there's multiple people with multiple effects.
And John.
So, not that you're wrong, Ellen, but it's a much bigger topic than this group.
Yeah, I know it is, but it wouldn't hurt the days to take Matt and I to the DOT and talk to Ada or whoever.
We will tell him.
Right, Matt?
Yeah.
We will
And
suggest to him. We'll tell him.
Yeah.
Needed to be said. I realize stuff has to do with this committee, but.
Okay, so I'm going to move off of
Yes,
supported living.
One more, just very small.
Yeah.
Again, back to this 3-line paragraph on transportation. One of the reasons we got away from lists in the past is because they're taken too literally and therefore become restrictive.
Right.
If somebody has a job in the morning and a different job in the afternoon, and relative close proximity was still requiring transportation, would the literal reading of this first sentence require that person to go back home again?
I don't know, but if it does, you might want to,
Yeah,
maybe you can suggest some different wording because that doesn't pass the common sense test.
In between, but common sense and literalism don't always
Yeah.
result in the same thing.
Hey.
Very good point.
Okay.
I would look at it, but Kenneth said I wasn't allowed to have a copy. But if it,
I didn't have my copy.
I
Kathy,
did not pass it out.
No,
You have
but
my
then you
copy.
passed out, you were sitting
I passed out? Just sitting here the whole
here, you
time.
can have my copy.
I'm good, Ellen, thank you. I think we're moving on to the next one, but.
So now that we're finished with it.
Now I can have it. Thank you.
We changed the staff thing.
It's not on
Yes,
here, but we have.
And one other thing that I don't think we've talked about yet, but we did mention the fact that individuals would be able to go back and forth between the 2 different services should they become separate.
Yeah.
And would also be able to access the 2 services at the same time. Because like you brought up, you may have somebody who is working 2 jobs and they're at kind of different places in those jobs. Or you may have somebody who has a job and then a few months down the road they take on additional job responsibilities and duties. So then they have to go back to kind of the support employment portion of it. So that's what we talked about.
Yeah, it does read that way, so we'll see if we can't fix it.
But it talks about, what's that? Oh, okay.
What did you change the staff to?
Where is this on the definition page?
Which one are you talking about?
Here's-
It's not on the definition page, but we have taken out the 3-year requirement. We thought about it as, well, we thought about it as being the same as any other habilitative because it's building skills, so why would you necessarily need more? But if you guys have suggestions to have more, then we can take those into consideration.
Actually,
Typically, yeah, because you get into that whole thing, which I've had a hard time balancing between the, as a provider of it, I'm only going to send somebody out who job coaches, who knows what they're doing. But that's me as a quality provider, and then you have the non-quality providers who might just send anybody to go and do the service, and that's not what you want. But you don't want to restrict yourself so much. And so that's such a hard balance, to protect it, for them to give the flexibility within it. And I don't know if there's a clear answer on that, but I think when we talked a little bit about specialized things that you would have, specialized training for different.
so here's another thing, which that I'm just thinking of just to throw problems into the mix. But the DOJ settlement for people under the TCLI initiative are going to have to adhere to the something or other model.
Oh, we don't want to do that.
What? Whoa.
What?
Yeah.
The Dartmouth model. And that was what was picked. It didn't have to be.
Yeah.
It's the DOJ, so our DOJ settlement to help people transition out of IMDs into community housing.
That's too restrictive? If we don't have to be that restrictive? I don't think.
But what I'm thinking of is at least for the staffing piece or what have you, it's like, these folks are gonna have to adhere to this model, which they are, I mean.
And money for a person has a different model.
And what else? No? Okay, I have no idea.
Well, yeah, that
Not my
definition,
specialty, but.
yeah, that's got a few issues with it. But I think what you're saying though is though, and it may be just like we were talking about with day support, honestly, I mean, would you want this, and I'm just throwing this out here as a question really is, would you want this service to be provided by somebody who doesn't already do VR services? Because are they going to be trained enough to have the staffing resources if you've never done this? If you say, okay, anybody can do supported employment and I'm just a small mom and pop.
Well, I think like everything else, yeah, you need to have some kind of parameters. Maybe you guys think about that, and send Kenneth your feedback.
So I'm just thinking like, maybe that's one of the things like with day supports, maybe it doesn't have to start from a licensed facility, but it has to be done by a licensed facility.
I think it probably
Something like that, that it doesn't necessarily have to go through VR, but be done by a licensed, or somebody who had contracts with the VR as a supported employment.
Yes, give us some suggestions.
So it
I'm
seems
lost.
like we're having two conversations.
I'm lost.
In due respect, first I've heard of it, you're saying there's going to be added a section that says staff qualifications. And what you're proposing, I'm sorry?
There is an added
Is it
section
in here?
in every waiver definition. Their provider qualifications are required.
Yep.
Now, for the lion's share of them, it is high school diploma or GED, 18, valid driver's license, clean criminal record checks, no listing on the healthcare registry. The 3 years of experience for supported employment was one of the ones that differed. And what we heard when we went out on the listeners tours and in here was that that was restricting people, especially in the college towns where people didn't have quite as much experience and they were moving in and out. So we took it out so there would be more flexibility. Trying to say that it's somebody that contracts with VR, well, I think we're going to be putting in another level of complexity because they're also going to have to be in the provider.
How is somebody right out of high school necessarily going to be a good supported employee?
And somebody right out of high school that necessarily would be a good person to have in the home doing rehabilitative training.
So let's think about that.
So,
I mean,
it's really anybody needs to have this.
Everybody under 30 is just untrustworthy.
So what is proposed? Change it from 3 to what?
It was proposed to take out the requirements
For the 3 years.
and look to the provider agencies to make sure that they're sending out staff that they feel comfortable.
We need at least required training, maybe, I don't know.
Well,
But
there's some basic training built in the first aid of CPR, the training in individual.
I don't mean like CPR, I mean like you're sending somebody out to do something that it's not so easy to find a job, I mean. I think it's a heavier lift than health services.
Right, I think, I hear what you're saying, and I like that we're not putting something so prescriptive as far as you have to have this many years and this to do this, because but the provider agency should have that kind of knowledge, But, and that's where I guess I'm not saying that necessarily the individual does, but just to provide any of these services, if you don't have some knowledge of what's required to do these types of jobs, if you have no clue what's required, like the benefits piece, such a huge piece. If I'm just doing this, I don't even know maybe that I need to check about benefits if I'm not a provider of supported employment already in some capacity. Not the staff itself, but as an agency, my manager of that should be overseeing those things to make sure that the people who are going out and doing these types of things.
I just don't think 18-year-olds old with driver's license is enough. I mean,
It also gets in that they are qualified for customized needs of the individual as described in the
well, let's back up. It's not here, we haven't seen it. Can we get that added when it goes out?
Yep.
Why isn't it in here?
We just, because they were usually stocking or removing it, so.
Yeah, and I like it being all in one section, not with every definition, because it gets redundant.
Yes, actually required within every definition.
Oh, it is, so it will be.
So, since you were seeing the same thing over and over again.
You just stop.
All right, so Matt's got the last comment,
I
and we're
just
going
like
to
to
move
say
on.
one thing, I'm not going to read this. and I'm under 30, so take this with a grain of salt. But I would just be careful with qualifications in the service definition. The only reason I say that is you're absolutely right that just having those qualifications and no others probably wouldn't qualify a person for a particular job. Being overly prescriptive can keep actually qualified people from holding a job or providing a service just because they don't fit under a specific technicality. So I would just encourage to be very careful and have the qualifications be there, but maybe have some flexibilities in there, like alternatives, like for example, if a person doesn't have 3 years of experience, you could say, or, you know, X amount of equivalent life experience. Like if a person has a disability, for example, and they're trying to, you know, provide supporting employment, you know, training, then obviously their life experience as a person with a disability is going to count for a lot. But the way the system works right now, that's not really quantified for the most part. So just be selective but flexible, I guess is what I would say, as far as
Next one.
And a lot of the topics that we've kind of touched on today, that quite a few have voiced concern over, is actually captured in the staff competencies of the technical guide, where it talks about knowing and understanding the benefits, knowing and understanding transportation. But what we can do is definitely take a look at those to ensure that
Well, yeah, and I think that goes back to my original point, which is it really should have been included in here then, if we were going to discuss it, and maybe when we use them on Monday, we can make sure they're added to that.
Sure.
So I guess a core question that I have here is that I'm older than most people in this room,
So you can be trusted 2 times over, so.
but I've been in lots of negotiations over the years, and required experience is related directly to the rate. As a provider, you have to pay more for higher levels of competence, and therefore that becomes the justification for the higher rate. So if you lower the experience, I caution you to consider and have conversations with your rate setters that that's not going to automatically put this rate comparable to the other rates where you're really expecting higher competence for this job, lower competence for technically for the other job, and you're going to end up with an equivalent rate that's hard to justify.
Right.
And it's hard to get competent people at the current rate.
Well, and I'd like to also throw in that this has supported employment has a specialized skill set, but I would hate to think that we think that supported employment staff need to be more well-trained than staff that are in the home doing other tasks, because each person is individual, and there are individual needs for each person that may fall on the spectrum. And you don't want to say, but supported employment staff need to get paid the most all the time because their job is the most.
I don't think that's what anybody's saying. I think all they're basically saying is what are your basic functions. I mean, you can, again,
there are competencies that
and again, we don't see them, so, I mean, I don't think it's a one thing versus the other conversation. I think it's this definition, these requirements, and this rate, and that's missing out of this piece of paper, so we'll have to look at what there is and see if we get suggestions on it, period.
Well, it is, and I agree 100% with that, but I also do know, like, for example, you mentioned somebody 18. Well, if I've spent most of my life taking care of maybe a parent or grandmother who was in the home, maybe I do have some of that skill set at 18. But I've not really looked for a job ever, or know what different jobs are out there and what they're needed to do them. I am going to need some sort of knowledge base to be good at that.
Right.
To go out there and to get employers, convince employers, they should hire somebody. It's not right, but it's there. The reasons, and sell, it sells. You know, why this person can work
There
and
needs
do
to
this
be
job.
support.
It does.
I'm going to table this because at this point we haven't read what's on there. And again, you can certainly make your recommendations based on what we find out are there. Can we wait until after Ellen because we really need to get moving?
May I say one thing?
One quick thing.
I have pre-employment questions. This is my own idea. Pre-employment questions help get the duds out and get good staff in sometimes, right? So that's my idea.
Pre-employment?
Yeah, pre-employment questions for any of the people that are on the waiver.
Okay.
And I'll send, and do you want me to send you my pre-employment questions?
You can send to Kenneth.
Okay.
Okay. So now we'll go on to crisis supports. And you have two sheets in front of you, but it'll become apparent as we go through this definition. So what are crisis supports? It's a service that provides intervention and stabilization for someone who's experienced a crisis, and then it also promotes prevention. So we're trying to build in that prevention as well. Authorization, we've talked about, we've heard from you guys before that there's a barrier to getting authorization. So we've built something in that can be verbally 24 hours, 7 days per week, and then someone can go back in and then send in their documentation within 5 days. So to try to make it more open, because that's what we heard from you guys.
It's within 5 working days.
5 working days, correct. So what we have for this crisis supports is it will be built based on 4 components. The first of which would be crisis intervention, stabilization, and supports. And we're thinking of this as kind of allowing for someone to really try to get in there when someone's having a crisis, to assess what's happening and to assess what's going on, and to actually provide that kind of direct intervention if needed and train on that. So it could be a first responder, it's going to assess the crisis, evaluate, provide direction, intervention, and determine if a higher level of intervention is needed. So someone who can really respond quickly. The second component, which...
Just to piggyback off that, so this component, today in the service definition, there's primary crisis response. And so the crisis intervention and stabilization is actually taking place of the primary crisis response. We felt like the wording was a little bit confusing between primary crisis response and first responder. You know, first responder just kind of being the agency's responsibility. If there's any sort of issue, and that issue can be outside of a crisis, it can be, hey, my staff didn't show up, or my staff came in late, or I have this issue or that issue. And we felt like people weren't really sure of what is the difference between primary crisis response and what is the difference between first responder. So we tried to make the language a little more clear so that way they know that this is in regards to a crisis, not just day-to-day responsibilities and responses from agencies to individuals.
Right. A second component is out-of-home crisis, and you'll see an in-home crisis on the next slide. And it's short-term for someone who needs structured support. It occurs in a licensed facility when other interventions have failed, or someone needs to be out of their home for whatever reason. And then it also can be for planned respite for someone who has had crises in the past.
I would say that the limitation on this, what defines short-term is it can be authorized for up to 30 days. There was a little wording that we changed from the current service definition into this service definition, which talks about for individuals who have high behavioral needs. What it says currently is for individuals who have tried to access respite and they've been unable to because of behavioral needs. And what we were finding across the state is that that was being interpreted a little bit differently, where some kind of regular respite, if you will, had to be tried and failed, regardless of the individual's needs or history. So we felt like we wanted to make it less of a barrier, if you will.
Then we have in-home crisis. and that short term again happens in the person's home. And why would you use it if you're at risk for out-of-home placement, or if the person has had crisis situations in the past? I mean, you know that they need that extra structure and support.
And what we talked about, this was kind of to be the same, but the opposite of out-of-home crisis. Sometimes if the individual's in a crisis, actually taking them from one house to another facility or location can actually increase or worsen the crisis, but they still need to have those wraparound supports, if you will. So keeping them in the location and providing them the supports that they need during that time frame. And so this is actually a brand new component to the crisis array, which is not available currently today.
And then the final part is which we kind of broke up and are thinking of putting in specialized consultative services, and that's your second sheet. And this is to facilitate the consultation, and we wanted this to give the opportunity to really build in prevention and to stay involved in people's lives who have crisis. So it can facilitate monthly face-to-face meetings to discuss, evaluate, and communicate, training natural supports and staff, technical assistance, and developing and implementing a plan for the person to go back home or whatever those barriers may be, so that really try to keep involved in people's lives who have a history of crisis.
And what we talked about this is currently within the crisis services array, there's the crisis behavior consultation. And what we were finding is not a lot of people understood the difference between crisis behavior consultation and specialized consultative services. And so we said, why not take the crisis behavior consultation out and put those components in with specialized consultative services, so that way it makes a little bit more sense, and have crisis services be more of a kind of response to crises, if you will, and then have specialized consultative services, which includes the crisis behavior consultation as well as other things, to be more of the preventative approach for individuals.
And then, go ahead.
What if my wheelchair breaks down and I'm out in the community and I need help? Am I supposed to call the fire department or what?
I would.
Or am I supposed to call this?
Or you supposed to call this, is that
Or
what
am I supposed to call crisis?
I'd call
That's
911.
a crisis to me. My wheelchair breaking down is a crisis. Isn't it, Matt?
Yeah.
So, what are we supposed to do about wheelchairs breaking down and stuff like that? If my wheelchair breaks down, then I don't have no one. I can't get around.
So what would you like that service to look like?
What would I like?
If it was your ideal, or Maddie, the one, I mean, what does it need to look like?
Well, Ellen, I don't know if you'd like to go first. I have some thoughts.
I have some thoughts too.
Okay, I'll let you go first.
I would like
Tell you, I'm not me.
to have something in here that says for individuals who are living on their own that have a crisis, or not a crisis as such, but wheelchairs breaking down or braces breaking down or something like that.
Emergency.
Yeah, an emergency.
Urgent situation.
Yeah, an urgent situation for us. But it may not be a crisis. But
It's a crisis in a different, if we look at it in a different way, it is a crisis because it's dealing with how your mobility and everything. So how do you
It's equipment.
Yeah.
It's equipment.
The caregiver can be a crisis for someone who lives, and that's their primary caregiver, and they live just with that person.
Exactly. That ties into what I was going to say, which is the first sentence of the narrative for this definition is crisis consultation is available to individuals that have significant and challenging behavior that have resulted in a crisis situation. Well, there are crisis situations that have nothing to do with behavior.
Yep.
And I realize that there is absolutely a place for things like a crisis support plan because there are people that have crises that need those behavioral plans and whatnot. But there needs to be either a different definition, or what would be easier if we just had like a clause in this definition that says that short-term supports in this same vein are available for non-behavioral emergency situations, or something to that effect, because pretty much everything that needs to be there is there in terms of how would I structure it. It just needs to also exist in a lens of there are other types of crises that I mentioned.
Right. Or is there someplace else that might fit?
If you see the definition, crisis is defined as change in circumstances like living,
Right.
direct support.
Well, that's why I tried to say equipment. It's completely different than behavior plans.
Yeah. Stuff like
This,
big wheelchairs.
this isn't about your equipment. That's a completely different definition.
I don't know.
Keeping with the prescriptive
They
approach,
needed-
rather than prescribe specifically examples that will become the definition of how that is, keeping the general circumstances. Anything that occurs to somebody with a disability that changes their ability to.
Right, but then you can take out your behavior.
You all need to have an equipment,
Well,
you all need to have an equipment definition.
I mean, I would add to that definition, keep the behavioral aspect, and to take the non-behavioral concerns that are going to be critical to survival, and add, again, it does need to be a specified, it needs to be a general list that says something that changes how I live in a normal circumstance.
What would short term do to this?
Well, no, I think that it could be in that optimally that crisis intervention part. So the first two sentences, crisis supports provides intervention for stabilization for individuals experiencing crisis, and then a crisis is defined as mental health or complex things, or people who present a threat to other people. So we could possibly, we could look at building in something comparable to other types of crises that are subject.
No.
But I don't,
Services to stabilize individuals who are having a behavioral crisis, so they don't have to access higher level services. But I think you bring up a very valid point that there are other types of crises, there's other types of situations, there's other types of emergencies, urgent situations, and so forth. And I think what we might have to do is look to see if it's either covered by other services, which one of the next services that we're getting ready to go over may help answer any questions, or to see what components can be added to this proposed definition.
Okay, but that happens, our braces, thing pops out, a thing pops out of my brace, and I can't walk for 2 days. So I can get to the brace shop for 4 days. If it happens over the weekend, I can't get to the brace shop. And I'm stuck in this wheelchair all day and all night, or all day.
Right.
And what happens if my tire blows out again? I had 2 tires blow out.
And we just need to make sure that, one, we're not duplicating something else that's covered by Medicaid, because we can't put spare parts for wheelchairs in the waiver if they're on the DMV list.
Well, I don't know if are you asking for the parts, or are you asking for somebody to come assist you?
I'm just asking somebody to come to assist me get home.
That may not be an authorization of, how long it
I had to call
takes
the
to get
fire
an
department.
authorization for something.
I had to call the fire department to come get me home.
And that's where some of those things, if you recall at the beginning, we were talking about the difference between primary crisis response and first responder from the provider agency.
Be responsible to deal with that.
Correct.
Yeah, but who's the first response?
It would be the individual from the provider agency.
Okay,
It depends
but
on-
when I called the provider agency, they don't know what first responder means.
And that may be an education.
Yeah, so that's a different, but we can definitely try to follow up
We
on that issue.
need to educate.
Right.
So let's have 2 more comments, 1 and 2, and then we'll take a 15-minute break.
Just to kind of follow up on what you're saying, I think it is kind of 2 separate issues because you don't need a behavior plan if your wheelchair breaks down. So it is 2 different things. And the other thing is, actually I have 3 things. The first sentence on the crisis support response only, prevention will be addressed, blah, blah, blah. It says, for the individual who experiences acute crisis due to mental health or complex behavioral challenges. I mean, isn't the person in an acute crisis because they're presenting a threat to themselves or their health and safety or other? I mean, why are we limiting this to mental health? I thought this was DD.
The way I read this, it isn't limited to.
Pardon?
It's the second part of the sentence. Crisis supports are for individuals, cut the intervening piece out, who present a threat to the person's health and safety.
And or the health and safety of others.
Right, but do we care why?
But if I'm the circumstance that presents a threat to my personal health and or safety, in any fashion, it doesn't, you have to qualify it as behavioral health.
In other words, get rid of the due to.
Yeah,
It's
well,
just
yeah.
If it was the mental health circumstance that was a problem, you wouldn't say who, you'd say which.
No, you're right. Doesn't matter.
So we've already
Right.
defined it as, I'm a person who's in a situation that is presenting a crisis, a danger to my own personal health and or safety. That's a pretty broad definition at that point.
The other question I have is, I understand that alternative family living is a daily rate, correct? And people who provide alternative family living are not allowed to access respite,
Well, we're
correct?
working on that. I think you missed a few of the previous sessions.
Right.
We're talking about letting them have access.
Well, I think the same is true here, in-home crisis services. You know, you don't want to eliminate somebody's ability to have that just because they're living in a situation with a daily rate.
Okay, makes sense.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to make sure.
Thank you.
Now, this is not replacing, it says crisis supports, this SES, this is not replacing a behavior plan, correct? It's not in place of.
No, a behavior plan?
Right.
This will be a service.
Yes, service.
Not.
Well, it talks about a plan put in place, and I kind of think, in one part of this, it talks about comprehensive crisis plan must be updated and warranted within 14 days. So not everyone would have, okay, I got it. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't replacing the behavior plan.
Okay.
To clarify, the in-home crisis supports, that's the additional staff? Yeah. That's what you want.
15 minutes. Be back at 10 till 3.
Thank you, guys.